Blue Sky Studios, you know them, famous for the likes of Ice Age and Ice Age and Ice Age and Ice Age and Ice Age. You know, maybe I'm starting to see how they fell apart already. Or is that the reason? I mean, this company is probably one of the biggest examples of an animation studio imploding before our very eyes. Who else was of the size and notoriety of Blue Sky that is now no longer active? So let's dig a little deeper into the full history of the studio with hindsight on our side to pinpoint any and all mistakes along the way that led the studio's legacy to be this. Remembered for one franchise now zombified elsewhere, a Robin Williams classic, a footnote of a late stage production, and their biggest turnaround not even being finished with them. This is our video essay of how Blue Sky died. And it all began back in 1987. 1987? Yes, somehow 1987, as Blue Sky Studios was initially just a VFX studio, being the remains of a past studio that was shut down in the 80s, MAGI, or Mathematical Applications Group. And we're talking VFX in the 80s here. Particular references we come to are the likes of the original Tron. Hey, it's a little dated now, but awfully ahead of its time and fits the theme of visual computer work, so I see it. And with work being put together to replicate real-world physics and lighting renders, this new company strove into a new direction of animation. Their first commission being a logo flying over the ocean in front of a sunset. A classic, really. And before their first animated movie in 2002, yeah, you know the one. The studio was first honing their skills and their engine as they worked on the visual effects for TV adverts. Whether it was for Pepsi, Nicktoons' shape-shifting cartoon bumper, time release capsules, or the very first computer-animated M&Ms, it was clear that this was a time of just paying the bills, developing skills as they went. And you could see a clear trajectory of progress as they continued in this grind. They earned a Clio Award for advertising for a Braun commercial that was initially mistaken as live action because of the photorealism of the Razor. Oh, look at that Razor render. Yeah, Braun. And then from 1997, they were working on the films, or at least assisting in some of the animation work on the side of these live action hybrid films. Did you know they handled some of the stuff in Mouse Hunt, Alien Resurrection, and Fight Club? That's so cool. Blue Sky. But it was also at this point where we start to see some of those business swings taking place. As the very first squeak of 20th Century Fox comes into the picture right here, with their own VFX company, brilliantly named VIFX, acquiring most of the company's stock holdings, essentially force directing the company from as early as here. Now, to be fair, it was from this point that the likes of character animation was introduced for film collaborations. But it could be argued that right here, back in 1997, that the very first seeds of the studio's canon ending were first planted in. A whole 5 years before even officially starting on the big screen, and Blue Sky as a company had been strung up and controlled by a bigger company with their own ideals. A man in the clouds of this Blue Sky, if you will. Whilst at the same time, it leaves one to question, why even accept an acquisition like this in the first place? What was the logic behind accepting a creative takeover? Was it out of desperation? Optimism? Naivety? The direction of the studio up to this point seemed to be a solid upward step-by-step of progress on the commercial sphere, but perhaps that just wasn't the goal. Typically, and I say this as someone who was also personally part of a production company at one point, the commercial stuff is often just a means to an end, a source of income and experience. The real goal, perhaps, was movies the entire time once it seemed to become a reality. And it especially makes sense when you consider the staff's history with the original Tron and the direction that they would go on afterwards. And perhaps a merger with an older, similar studio seemed like a combination of heads that could make that dream a reality. Blue Sky had already been commissioned by the likes of big brands, so it's unlikely to imagine this merger as a result of hard times. But whether the full effect of a majority interest on the stakeholder side of things came with any anguish is hard to pinpoint. This is 1997 after all. Communications weren't exactly so transparent back then for specific details and opinions. That being said, two notable figures gained a boost in their roles from this. Richard Hollander of VIFX became the President of Combination, which is an interesting title, whilst David Brown, one of the main MAGI employees and a marketing executive back in the day, who also has a resume in CBS and Fox, became CEO of this new Blue Sky / VIFX studio. Despite it not really being clear how or why these kind of business decisions would become the norm, the fact of the matter is, it does become the norm, especially for Blue Sky. And remember, the parent company to VIFX was 20th Century Fox themselves. So the big defining higher-up is already in the picture back here. And as for the success for this new duo studio? Well, here's a quote from one of the digital artists about the circumstances. At the time of Star Trek IX, 20th Century Fox had acquired both VIFX and Blue Sky. We went under the combined name of Blue Sky / VIFX for about a year, but the companies were never actually integrated together in a meaningful way. Yep, though not precisely a disaster of a merger, from the sounds of things, the two studios were still pretty notably separate. With one in Southern California and the other to the east in New York, each worked on their own separate projects, simply under the same umbrella name. And there are successes there, like Titanic being a big one around this time, but whilst VIFX was falling on harder times, Blue Sky had a side project up their sleeves. Starting way back in 1990, a little short film by the name of Bunny had been the passion project of Blue Sky founder Chris Wedge. Intending to demonstrate CGI animation in a short film, it would slowly go into production through the 90s, revolving around a rabbit widow who's irritated by a moth before being led into a heavenly glow, reuniting with her husband. Sounds dynamic and ambitious for early animation, and it was! Alongside a few notable people that helped bring it together, a newly graduated student in Carlos Saldana, and an official assignment from producer Nina Rappaport, 8 years from the start in 1998, and Bunny released to an Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. Just immediately, and unsurprisingly to hear, it was indeed Bunny that would be the fuel for Blue Sky going on to produce full-length theatrical CGI animated movies. No more anguishing over the likes of how to animate a reflective slime substance like flubber. What a gig that must have been. And so, as Blue Sky reached new heights, their partner studio fell to the wayside, to the point that 20th Century Fox specifically sold VIFX to another VFX house, Rhythm and Hues Studio. Ooh, okay, the people behind Life of Pi. Oh, they filed for bankruptcy 3 months later. And also the VFX artist protest outside the Oscars? And the VFX supervisor's speech was cut off by Jaws music for mentioning the studio? Oof, 2013. Maybe this 90s merger was cursed from the very start. But anyway, the Blue Sky side of things was kept by Fox as the potentially viable option, although they too were considered to be on the chopping block due to VFX being under financial difficulties in general in like the early 2000s. Perhaps if Blue Sky was sold off and did its own thing from now, it could have done its own thing and still been here today. Maybe that was the mistake at the core of it all, before they'd even started. Anyway, they weren't sold off in 2000 because of a last-minute pitch to Fox regarding a whole new comedy feature film by the name of Ice Age. Yes, this is where it all went down. Finally! Who knew the studio had such a rich history before getting to day one? And all it took was the daring submission from the likes of Chris Wedge, producer Laurie Forte, and Christopher. It's Chris Meledandri stepping into the picture. How did he even get here? How long has he been here for? When did this happen? All my research up to this point doesn't even mention him as a relevant figure. Where did he come from? Why now? How here? Is this where it all goes wrong? I mean, Illumination is still going now. Illumination is thriving while Blue Skies died. Was it him? So, Chris Meledandri, born 1959. He was a 20th Century Fox guy from the mid-1990s, standing on the accolades of cool runnings to be trusted with producing financially successful family films. And soon enough, he was placed in charge of 20th Century Fox Animation, releasing Titan AE in 2000, a box office bomb so negative it almost got him fired, but it didn't. Is that the defining moment that destroyed Fox and Blue Sky? Debatable. The guy clearly knows how to make good money later down the line anyway. But his choices with this film at least led to Fox Animation Studios being closed off. Wow, it's not until you hear the full history of a single studio that you come to learn how many lived and died along the way. It was Chris Meledandri who actually led the Fox acquisition of Blue Sky Studios back in 1998, and he was the one who oversaw the creative and business operations of Blue Sky. For the past few years now, it has been him. Blue Sky is his story. And he was one of the bigwigs pushing for this little project called Ice Age that he would go on to executive produce. But it wasn't all sunshine just yet. As though they may have just been about to hit their cultural significant peak, behind closed doors it was always a little tough on Blue Sky. As right beforehand, studio management apparently pressured staff to sell their remaining shares and options to Fox on the promise of continued employment on feature films. Yes, now Blue Sky Studios is wholly owned by Fox, and from here, the studio became merely a puppet to what the higher-ups say. And of all people, Chris Meledandri was probably the one with the most wiggle room. Selling your shares, probably the most classical business mistake you can make in the grand scheme of things. And it's a corporate takeover from a bigger bully way back in the early 2000s. You could very well say that this here was the moment that Blue Sky really died. Not just from the decision making of the real drivers from this point onwards, high and low, but on the ground level, it was at this point that the company was no longer a company just for its staff. When first founded, this studio was a sanctuary of the remains of Magi. A chance for creators to choose their own path and work together, even collecting shares in the company as they went. But here, it's officially removed from them. And what do you know, it was 20th Century Fox the whole time. One could go on to wonder just what could have happened to Blue Sky had this entire Fox acquisition not taken place here. Would they have returned to animations and commercial work that's still ongoing today? Or even assisting with other films, live action or animated, just as a smaller assistant rather than a frontrunner? Or heck, maybe another route could have still given them the theatrical front, but without the big wigs on their shoulders. Whatever the case or the argument, we are still behind the very peak of Blue Sky, so perhaps we can't exactly say that Doom was seeded here necessarily. It's all down to the late stage decisions, right? And so, 2002, Ice Age 1 was made. Hey there, you're halfway through this video, so come along and subscribe if you haven't already to check out other video essays that we're gonna do regularly now. Alright, cheers! Now, there's a murmur of info here that says Fox terminated half of the staff anyway during Ice Age 1 and tried to sell the film and studio fearing a box office bomb, but I really can't find a viable source for it. So don't believe that info, but maybe hold on to it. You know, it adds great stakes. But then eventually, yes, it releases as a commercial and critical hit. The first feature film, and it gets a nomination for an Academy Award for Best Animated Feature in 2003. Just like Bunny, immediately awarded as competent and exemplary. And can you blame them? Ice Age 1 is a bona fide classic. Though the textures look a little prehistoric and the lighting is simplistic, this film is nothing less than iconic. With a memorable soundtrack, eternal characters, and a heartfelt story, not to mention a refreshingly brilliant premise and even some silent filmmaking in there. Easily, this is one of the very best movies that Blue Sky ever made, and perhaps that makes it one of their largest mistakes. While being a tall mountain of success right out of the door, it also acts as an overbearing shadow for the rest of the future of Blue Sky Studios, as we will quickly come to see over the next decade. But reveling in the good, this film in the early 2000s established Blue Sky Studios as one of the 3 major CGI animated movies, against Pixar and DreamWorks. That's about as high praise as you can realistically get. With Disney still doing 2D at this point, Blue Sky are in 3rd place in the world at this point, and I certainly noticed them as a kid. However, we then look at how the studio directed its follow-up movies as the grind simply continues under Fox's full management. 2002, Ice Age 1. 3 years later, we get Robots, 2005. Another brilliant classic, creating a world of bionics rather than organics. It's a brilliant blend of kids' entertainment and adult humor, and notably quite a bit more daring than its Disney rival. And honestly, if this was the continued tone of movies going forward for Blue Sky, I think we would all be quite satisfied with the progress of the studio, finding its own dynamic voice with these deeply creative worlds and ideas. And also anti-capitalism snuck in there. Politics for kids right on the outset, just like A Bug's Life. Does Ice Age count as a climate change movie as well? I guess technically. Plus it's got the Robin Williams! What a goldmine of a character to play around with! But there's a catch. Despite Robots hitting #1 at the box office during its opening weekend and amassing a full total of $260 million worldwide, This was against an $80 million budget. And that $180 million profit is a notable step down from Ice Age's $383 million worldwide. Furthermore, Ice Age retained a 77% approval rating, and Robots was down to 64. Blasphemy, if you ask me. Though, do you really think Chris Meledandri cares about the likes of critical responses? Either way, Robots never came back. Maybe it shouldn't. We don't need sequels out of every movie that does slightly well. A studio that defines itself by constantly spitting out sequels is obviously doomed from the start. Ice Age 2: The Meltdown. Perhaps this is where Blue Sky made their pivotal mistake. Because by normalizing one sequel, you mobilize all the sequels. Ice Age 2 was once again a brilliant classic. The best case scenario for a sequel movie, and would go on to make an increased $667 million at the box office. This next installment is reported to be the 160th highest grossing film of all time now. It is the franchise that defines this studio, for better or for worse, but it's the in-betweens that really show what counts. Disney has the formula of one big musical and one big non-musical, so switching between old reliable and experimental originals just makes sense. So what's the next in-betweener? Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who. I mean, I'll be honest, this film is ugly. It's 2008, but without the Disney level budget here. So we can't exactly expect modern Illumination level lighting, but this movie to me just looks bleak. And all the grays really don't help the matter. This movie, I personally didn't notice as a child. Maybe it was because I was 12 and discovering the internet at the time, but the box office doesn't reflect that, thankfully. As with a stellar cast with Jim Carrey, Will Arnett, Seth Rogen, Amy Poehler, and Steve Carell. I'm seeing some similarities in this cast. But also, Selena Gomez and Joey King? Huh. This movie went on to make $298.5 million worldwide. Hey, that's an uptick from Robots. Though it does also have the helping hand of being a recognizable Dr. Seuss IP. And this upward trajectory only continues upwards nearer to the 2010s as Ice Age 3: Dawn of the Dinosaurs is just the next best, easiest pick for children to come in swaths in 2009. And it worked! Becoming the third highest grossing film of 2009 against everything, and still standing at number 97, only replaced in animation by The Incredibles 2. 9 years later. Worldwide, it gathered $886.7 million in total. Massive for not even the 2010s yet. Billions were not on the table yet, but with a solid trilogy under the belt, that really should have been the end of it. This would go on to stay as the highest grossing Ice Age movie, and the true shadow that looms over Blue Sky Studios. But you know where this is going. With Fox at the helm and Chris, 4 Despicable Me's and 2 Minion movies and counting Meledandri, of course they would continue the trend even with diminishing returns. Wait a minute. Where is Chris? What? He's not at Fox anymore? Well then where did he go? What could he possibly be up to? Illumination. Founded in 2007 and actively releasing movies from 2010, the guy who was once 1/3 of the first major Blue Sky pitch was now a direct rival, with all the financial accolades on his side. It might not have an effect right now, but it's an important marker to make when considering the wider context for the fall of Blue Sky Studios. But coming back to inside the company in a backwards way, you could say that Dawn of the Dinosaur was Blue Sky's ultimate doom. A tale to always be chasing from now on, whilst also the most financially successful, probably by taking the easy route of success. How very Illumination. The last influence of Meledandri, perhaps. But first, Rio! And again, what an absolute classic. Sure, it's only 72% on Rotten Tomatoes, but it raised $484 million in total worldwide gross. A solid venture that's piece by piece an expansion for the studio. Momentum was clearly going. What could possibly be going wrong? 2012, Ice Age 4: Continental Drift. And the continental drift of box office success is starting to slip. The movie itself was lackluster. Boring, reusing the story beats of earlier films in a way that loses its creative charm and premise the franchise was founded on for the most corporate add-on to date. 37% on Rotten Tomatoes, but only a slap on the wrist. Because the IP branding has strength, and that strength still gathered an audience of $877 million in value. Perhaps if they had made less money, they wouldn't have been so naive to run it again one more time later on. Maybe the mistake was not spotting the lesson here. Despite the profit, perhaps it was here that they truly lost their audience, when Ice Age no longer was the bastion of a great franchise. I remember I certainly felt that way at the time. Audiences didn't know about the quality they were paying for until it was already paid. And maybe losing the audience's trust at this point can be the explanation for the rapid decline that will follow from here. Ice Age by this point no longer became a figurehead for a creatively expansive franchise with great ideas, but an elongated drift of rehashing a tired and old world. But more so than that, the rate at which movies were coming out skyrocketed. I mean, they were always fairly regular with 2 to 3 year gaps, but 2011, 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, 17, it was yearly at this point. Whilst at the same time, it seems as though the company were starting to step away from Ice Age. Epic came out with a massively different aesthetic that we would come to know from the studio's usual output, but at just $286 million worldwide, it's a notable drop-off in attention. All the while, rival animations came out that same summer with Pixar's Monsters University, as well as Illumination's Despicable Me 2. Ooh, it's Chris Meledandri in the other car. At a time when Blue Sky was floundering over its new experimental direction, and this is the likes they have to go up against. Rio 2 comes out next in 2014, another sequel movie to their next best successful franchise. Does it have the longevity to make a new Ice Age super franchise out of? Ish. Though it made almost $500 million, more than the first movie. Its approval rating was 48%, and Chris Meledandri isn't here anymore to not care about it. So, if an original can't work, and a sequel is dodgy, how's about another adaptation? That worked out fine last time. The Peanuts movie! I can't show you any of the footage because the rights owners are particularly sharky online. But just know it made $246 million. Not exactly crazy, especially for an already known IP. If only they allowed more external, free advertising in other forms that aren't just established media. Shame. And so, of course, come round to 2016 and it's not looking too grand. And after the repeating fourth sequel and every other example coming with diminishing returns, of course, Blue Sky Studios returns back to Ice Age for another sequel. This time at least a little less soulless? No, 18%. The worst the studio has ever seen, and chances are, this was at least the final nail in the coffin for the studio, figuratively. Was the mistake just the incompetent writing, or the very existence of the movie in the first place? It clearly comes from a notable decline, so you'd expect desperation would spur a stronger attempt. But alas, the audience weren't expecting much from last time, and were given even less than that. This would be the last Ice Age movie under Blue Sky Studios, an elongated whimper from what was once the third best in the industry. But the studio doesn't quite end there. Of all things, Ferdinand releases in 2017. Another adaptation with decent reviews of 71% and a worldwide gross of $269 million. Blue Sky seems to be in a constant state of just about doing well enough to justify continuing, just like Ice Age 4 encourages Ice Age 5, and no movies being a catastrophic bomb. It's just been a dragged out whimper as long as it can be for the studio as a whole. So then how did we get here, considering there was a moment where the direction of the studio up to a certain point seemed to be a solid upward step-by-step of progress? But come to March 2019 and Disney got involved. Acquiring all of 20th Century Fox meant that Blue Sky was being inhaled as well. As perhaps it wasn't a single studio probably, but the head honcho of the whole thing handling things wrong. After all, they were the ones in control since the early 2000s. The heads of the studios would now be long replacements of the ones who founded the company in the 80s. And with the release of Spies in Disguise at the end of the year, Tom Holland and Will Smith, now the actors involved, at a 77% and a total gross of $171.6 million, this would be Blue Sky's biggest failure. Right before COVID, it was the final blow. Consumed by the studio that wasn't even in the 3D business when they started. and in April of 2021, it was officially shut down. So, how did Blue Sky die? You can blame it on a lot of things, but arguably, there was no direct nosedive. It was more like a collection of small pivots in the wrong direction that ultimately faded the studio into obscurity. The Disney acquisition didn't bolster the studio. Lockdown shackled all of animation. Ice Age 5 was a quality bomb. The scrappy experimental pieces didn't pick up speed enough. Ice Age 4 soullessly lost its audience. Chris Meledandri became a rival to the studio. Fox acquired the entire studio and forced the creative direction, even taking shares from all of its staff. The studio accepted the first merger with VIFX in the 90s. They stopped producing commercial and assistant CGI work, and they drowned in the shadow of their biggest successes. Do you blame the people for accepting the first dodgy deal? Or do you blame the decades of poor decision-making with hindsight in mind? Or is it the ones who actually brought down the shutdown hammer? Whatever the case, it's an interesting case study to see such a scrappy animation studio struggling through hardships in a way that its rivals managed to commandeer through. The fight with Blue Skies was a fight, seemingly, the entire time. Not necessarily heaped in controversies, but just financial struggles, getting by just enough with each subsequent movie until it lost steam somewhere along the way. My personal argument would be that it was a consistent lapse in judgment on 20th Century Fox's front, commandeering the studio in all the wrong directions, whilst if there was anything close to a quick nosedive, I'd say it was Ice Age 4. They lost their audience then, and never really recovered. Whatever the case, despite its ending, Blue Sky Studios still holds some of the most magical and investing animated film experiences that can be celebrated and enjoyed, even if some of it was finished via another production company entirely, or crassly reanimated for all the more corporate shilling. That's just the industry, baby. And you can't expect a blue sky every day. Sometimes for the plants to grow, you need a little rain. And you need to keep the foxes out next time. Plus, the workers are still about. Scattered, but they're still out there somewhere. The soul and the magic and the talent is still there somewhere. It's never truly a loss, especially since we can buy them on DVD and replay them eternally. For now, though, I'm going to end things off there. My name's been Daz. Thank you very much for reaching the end of this video. Do tell me your thoughts on Blue Sky Studios, how you think it died, what was your best memory of it, what film did you see first. I'm happy to hear any and all discussion, and I shall see you all in a little bit. Bye-bye now.